What happens when someone tries to own even a shadow?
Imagine being sued for stealing something you can't even hold, something that stretches, contorts, and completely vanishes when the sun goes down. That was the charge brought against an exhausted traveler who made the mistake of sitting down to rest under the canopy of a massive tree. The tree's trunk sat inside the walled compound of a notoriously greedy landowner, but its branches reached over the wall, casting a wide shade patch onto the public road. It is a clash between a basic human need for shelter and an extreme interpretation of where one man's property begins and ends. Seeing the man resting, the landowner stormed out and demanded rent for the use of his tree's shade. The traveler refused. He argued that the shade was a byproduct of nature, cast onto a public road for anyone to enjoy. The landowner wouldn't budge. He dragged the traveler to court, determined to use the law to squeeze a profit out of the sun itself. This forces a question with no easy answer. How does a legal system handle a claim that is morally ridiculous, but technically supported by the letter of property law? Inside the courtroom, Judge Ramanna took a surprising path. He listened to the landowner's complaint and agreed with him entirely. The judge's reasoning was simple. If the tree belonged to the landowner, then everything it produced, including its shadow, was his private property. But there was a catch. Because the landowner demanded money for the use of that property, he had effectively created a formal lease agreement. Under the laws of tenancy, a landlord retains the deed, but a paying tenant has the absolute right to occupy the space they are renting without being harassed. By demanding rent, the landowner reclassified the passing traveler as a tenant, giving him an ironclad right to occupy the property he was paying for. The landowner had his money, but he had failed to account for the movement of the solar system. At midday, with the sun overhead, the rented shade sits safely outside the compound. But as the sun drops, the shadow elongates over the wall. Exercising his rights, the traveler follows his shadow across the courtyard, the kitchen, and finally into the landowner's private bedroom. Faced with a stranger legally entitled to sit in his bedroom, the terrified landowner begged for forgiveness and dropped the case. By demanding strict adherence to the letter of the law, the landowner inadvertently signed away his own privacy. To understand why this worked, we have to look at the specific intellectual tactic Judge Ramanna used to settle the dispute. He employed a concept from logic and mathematics known as reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity. This is a method of disproving an argument by accepting it as absolute truth and then mapping out its inevitable, ridiculous conclusion. When the logic is followed to its limit, the entire system collapses. Ramanna didn't argue about kindness or morality. He simply took the landowner's own rigid rules and followed them until they became a trap. Perfectly enforced bad logic eventually destroys itself. This case offers a different way to look at what fairness actually looks like in practice. We often assume that fixing an injustice requires writing new rules or shouting down the people in power. But there is a particular elegance in simply weaponizing a broken rule against the person who created it. Sometimes justice isn't about finding a middle ground.
In business and in life, the more tightly we try to control everything, the more we lose peace, trust, and balance. Some stories entertain us, but some stories change the way we think. Watch more powerful stories that teach business and life lessons only on Creative Subbu YouTube channel.